Welcome to the Careers by Jen podcast, episode 299. On this penultimate edition of the podcast, Jen has one more essential interview to conduct with me.
Hey, I'm Jen Swanson, and Careers by Jen is where I help you to get the job, love your work, and advance your career, and I talk about wellness and success topics too. This podcast is actually ending production after episode 300. However, you can find me over at Careers by Jen on YouTube, where I will be continuing to share career tips, advice, wellness, and success topics, and much, much more. It's been a 10-year run here on Careers by Jen on the podcast, and until we are at episode 300, I invite you to continue listening. Go back and listen to the archives, and please enjoy this show. Thank you so much for being here. What are the stories that you tell, and how do they inform the world that you live in, inform your career, your job search? How do they inform the work that you do and your relationship with others, and even with yourself? Well, this is some of what we're going to talk about today, along with a few other fun bits too. I'm Jen Swanson, and I am so glad you are listening today. This is the second to last episode, so if you're new here, this is your first time, welcome. It's a good thing there's a backlog of episodes for you to listen to. And if you are someone who's been listening for a while, welcome back. Lovely to have you here. The Careers by Jen podcast is recorded on the unceded and traditional territories of the Coast Salish people, including the Katzie, the Kwantlen, the Stolo, and the Coquitlam First Nations. Today, I am interviewing my husband, Scott Swanson of Scott R. Swanson Holistic Coaching, and also more commonly known as the Scary Voice Intro Dude. I hope you enjoy this conversation. So, Scott, I'm going to start by asking you, what's with the scary voice, dude?
So back when you started the podcast, there was a show on the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, Radio 1, in the morning. It's still on the air, actually. It's called As It Happens. It's kind of a morning, daily current events deep dive program. And in its original form, it started off with an actor who had a very deep voice, who started off with an introduction, and it was very great, and it was different. And they've since changed the format. He's gone on and done other things, but so when you asked me if I wanted to be involved in some way or do an intro, I can't remember exactly what the request was. And I was trying to think of something that would be different. And I thought of this guy who was called on the radio. They called him The Voice. And so I tried it out, but my voice isn't as deep as his. So when I tried to make it really deep, it just sounds sort of pseudo-psychotic instead of just deep, but that's okay.
And you get fan mail and everything you have over the years. It's been kind of fun.
Yeah, and I think it also creeps a few people out, but whatever.
Well, there you go. So in our, we talked once before on the show. You came on quite early on. I can't remember what episode number it was, and talked about spiritual direction. Your website changed since then, and you're doing some different things, but you're still doing that a little bit.
I am still doing spiritual direction, and I've since kind of morphed that a bit more into coaching, personal life coaching, some executive coaching and training, and a lot of the similar things to what you do, although not specifically in the area of employment. But yeah, this is kind of a new iteration and a new initiative for me just in the last year.
So, we're talking today about stories and how the stories that you tell inform the life that you lead, the work that you do. Can you tell us more about why stories?
Yeah, well, as I got into this, and a lot of coaches can relate to this, that unless you're working in a very specific area like fitness or weight loss or maybe employment or something like that, a lot of people who get into life coaching, the skills are usable across various disciplines, and so most people who coach can coach in any number of areas unless they're teaching a specific set of skills. But that's, in this world, you need to, the conventional thinking is that people need to specialize, and you sort of need an angle or a shtick or a particular kind of approach that you take, a method you teach, whatever. And so I had a sense of the values and the principles that I wanted to bring into the work, but I didn't have a particular angle per se. And stories came about really through an epiphany. I think it was within the last couple of years, we were watching a special on Netflix that Brene Brown did. And she's on a stage in front of an audience, and she's talking about telling various stories along the themes of the kind of areas that she works in. And she's telling this story about she and her husband who are out swimming in a river, and they have an argument. And so in the process of working this through, she tells the audience that they have this practice that when one of them is upset and the other person is inclined to want to sort of read into that or make assumptions about what's going on, instead of doing that, they say, "The story I'm telling myself right now is." And when she said that, it was like an epiphany in sort of the true sense of that term, where I didn't see anything that I hadn't seen before, but I somehow saw things in a slightly different way. And the centrality of stories, the power of stories suddenly became evident to me in a way that it hadn't before. I've always loved stories. I mean, I think, all of us when we're kids, we love stories. We love people reading to us. Many people enjoy reading themselves, movies, all the different ways that stories get told in our culture. When I got into university, before I started studying theology, I was studying psychology and philosophy and literature. And so stories have always been kind of an important theme in what I've done. And even in the theological world, stories have been kind of a really important, I guess, tool that I've used in all of my work. And so it's an organic move into coaching from a place of stories. And it also, there's this thing in psychology called confirmation bias, which is that thing when you buy a new car and you're driving home and suddenly you start seeing that car everywhere that you hadn't seen it before, and you're wondering where all these people got the same car from. And it's kind of like that, once with stories, once I started thinking in terms of stories as this interpretive framework for how we process reality, I just started seeing it everywhere, and everything becomes story.
And so, how are you using stories in the work that you're doing with clients?
Well, so as I say, I think stories play into everything. So I have come to think of story as a primitive and yet still ubiquitous technology. A technology in the sense that it's one of the tools that humans use for interpreting experience. So whether it's an internal experience we have, a thought or a feeling, an emotion, whatever it is, or whether it's something we see in the world around us, we have this piece of material that comes into our consciousness. And what we immediately do is we tell a story about that. And the thing about stories is that when you tell because we tend to tell the same stories over and over again, right? And if you've been around one person for any length of time, you will start to hear after a while that they have a set of stories that they repeat, and very often these stories are how they think about the world, or how they think about themselves in the world. So stories are, after a while, they stop being stories when we've told them enough, and they start just becoming reality. And we can't distinguish. It becomes harder to distinguish between what is an interpretive framework we're putting on reality versus what is reality itself. And so from a change perspective, when we don't realize that what we're doing is telling a story about something, and what we think we're doing is just simply regurgitating reality as it, absolutely is the way everybody would see it, then we lose the ability to, it becomes hard, it becomes solid, and we can't, it becomes much harder to get around. When we understand that it's actually a narrative, that it's actually an interpretation that we're making rather than a hard reality itself, it becomes possible, I think, to choose other interpretations, to start thinking about reality in different ways. Once we do that, we can start choosing different narratives that serve us better, or that serve the world better in some way.
So what informs these interpretations?
What informs the interpretations? Well, I think it's, there's probably a whole complex set of things that inform those interpretations. I think it's partly our experience, it's partly our habit, it's partly our upbringing. It's probably partly biology. Why are some people more inclined to be optimistic and other people more inclined to be pessimistic? Like, like the roll of the dice. I'm sure there's a whole number of factors at play in, how we end up becoming the people we become, and how that influences the way we tend to see the world and interpret things. Family of origin, personality. There's all kinds of variables, I think, that come into play. And those also influence, I think, the capacity to be able to hold these interpretations of reality more lightly, and in the process have some flexibility around choosing other interpretations, so that some people have a really hard time, right? They once they have kind of grasped something and taken it on as part of their identity, that can be very hard to let go of. That can become a psychological threat to begin to change one's fundamental understanding of the world and how things are. And some people just have a really hard time with that, and other people, for whatever reason, it's easier.
And some people want to change the story, and some people don't, right?
Yeah, I think so. I think, some people are either happy enough with the narratives that they have either been given by others or have created, or it feels like too much of a cost to let go of them. As I said, too much of a psychological threat, or even a threat at the level of being, and other people have an easier time with that.
Well, sometimes people benefit from the stories that they hang on to.
Well, sure, because we all live in an ecosystem that we have both, that's a combination of what's been given to us and what we've created, right? It's given to us by our family of origin, by our culture, by all the early influences in our life. And we take bits and pieces of that and we meld that with our own personality, our own, whatever we bring to it. And we create this ecosystem. And it functions whether it functions well or not, whether it's healthy or not, or the extent to which it's healthy or unhealthy, it still works. And so some people are more or less inclined to want to mess around with that. Some people, in the circumstances of their life, will come up against the limits of that ecosystem and realize that they need to do something different. Yeah, and other people don't do that. So whatever ecosystem you have created for yourself, that you've kind of collaborated in developing, the way you see the world, that works in as much as like you've gotten this far with it, right? So it's not completely, it's not that it doesn't work. It's more a question of how well does it work, and is it still serving you?
And stories in a communal level unify us or divide us, don't they?
Yeah. So I think, again, this whole notion of once you start thinking in terms of story, you can see it everywhere. The story, all these stories exist at multiple levels, all at the same time. So there are stories at the level of our society. Fairy tales, children's story, Disney, all of those are stories at a kind of a societal or cultural level. Advertising is all a set of cultural stories. Then there's the stories in your family of origin. Then there are the stories that different groups gather around, right? So a particular religious tradition, a particular political tradition, any kind of ideology is a group of stories. And one of the ways that people recognize who is in their group is by the stories they tell, right? So if we have a shared set of stories, nationality is a group of stories that a certain people who live within certain boundaries and believe certain things, they have this group of stories in common. And so they also they not only serve to help us gather with people who are like us, but they also define us in terms of who we are not, which can be one of the problems, right? Because then it's a small step from there to say, it's a small step from saying, well, those people have different stories to the stories that we have. It's a small step from that to say their stories are inferior to ours. They are inferior to us. They are not even really like us. And so, we can do whatever we want because we're us and they are them. And so the little things that differentiate us become these huge gulfs that we use to gather people who we perceive to be like us in a certain way. And separate us from people who are not like us.
So how hard is it for someone to change their story or the story they're telling if they want to?
I think if people want to change, it is... Is it, how hard is it? I think it is challenging. It can be challenging. It requires intentionality and effort, but I don't think it is hard in the sense of it being impossible. I think if one is committed and mindful and not just clear about what stories they're telling that they want to let go of, but what stories do they want to be telling instead? I mentioned earlier that I think of stories as a technology, and so and I think of technologies as mostly value neutral, in the sense that it's not so much, it's what we do with those technologies that for the most part makes them positive or negative, good or bad. And stories are like that. So I don't think that it's possible to live without stories. I think, it's an essential component of how we have evolved as a species. And so the question then is, if you're going to let go of a story, if you're going to change a story, then it requires a little bit of intentionality around what are you going to replace that story with? What's the new story that you want to tell that you think is going to serve you and the world better than the one you're telling now that you have come up against the limits of and are feeling like it's not serving you anymore?
So in the work that you've done with clients, what's sort of a big aha that has happened because of somebody being willing to change their story?
I think one of the things I notice is that people realize they have choices that they didn't, that they weren't as aware of before. Things that felt solid now feel flexible and malleable. Things that felt immovable are now optional. And so there can be a sense of freedom and possibility, of excitement of liberation around the realization that one can choose not to be tied to a particular interpretation of something, to not be tied to seeing that as a fixed reality, and to be able to see it as something that they have some agency, some power around being able to shift for themselves.
So I want to bring it back to career stuff for the Careers by Jenn audience. And I want to ask about stories in the workplace and in looking for a job, in loving your job more, in advancing your career.
Yeah. So in terms of looking for a job, you can go all the way back to the beginning around this. In terms of what kind of a job are you looking for? What kind of a career are you looking for? And what are the stories you tell yourself about what's important in a career? What's possible? What you're capable of doing? What you're good at? What matters? Does money matter? And if money matters, if making a lot of money matters, whose story is that? Is that a story that you picked up from somewhere early on? Or is that a story you created for yourself? And where did that story come from? And are you happy with that? And so that example around money, you can apply to any aspect of what you're looking for in a career. So one of the stories, for example, that I always tell about myself, and I tell other people as well, and this is one of the ways, by the way, that story soon stops becoming an interpretation and starts becoming a fact. It starts becoming a reality. So one of the stories I tell is that I am no good with my hands. I can, measure a board 3 times and still cut it wrong. Absolutely useless. So, if I was considering a career as in any trade, one of the stories I would be telling myself very early on is, well, I can't do that. I don't have the natural ability to, be able to be a carpenter or a plumber or an electrician or something like that.
It took us 2 hours to put a doorknob on once.
Yeah, well, I'm not saying these stories aren't grounded in some level of truth. Like, unless we're completely psychotic, we have hard evidence for believing the things we believe and telling ourselves the stories we tell. But my point is that as long as I'm telling myself the story that I'm useless with my hands, that's going to affect the kind of job, the kind of career I choose to go down. If I told myself a different story, yeah, you know what? I am no good with my hands, and I am a good learner. Right? Now suddenly maybe something becomes possible that wasn't possible before. Okay, get the job. Love your work. So love your work and advance your career. I mean, loving your work. So once we're into a work situation, particularly if we're working in an office situation or some kind of a situation where there are other people around, we're now dealing with so you have all the stories yourself, all the stories that you tell. If you're working for a company, that company has stories, right? It may have a hashtag, it may have a mission statement, it may have a set of corporate values. All of those are stories. Your supervisor has their own set of stories. They have the stories that they are supposed to be bringing from the company and making sure they're bringing into their work. They also have all the personal stories as a human being that they bring. All of your coworkers have all of their stories. So you can see how very quickly you've got this big pot of stew of various stories, many of which are going to contradict each other at one point or another. And so, how do you, in order to love your work, so to be thinking about like how much do you, for you personally, because different people are going to be different on this, do your stories need to align with the company story? For some people, that's really important. That kind of integrity with the organization they're working for. Other people have an easier time parking that at the door and saying, well, but I do this job and it, provides my family with a living, or whatever other values you're bringing to that. What are let me think, love your work. What are the ways in which your stories bump up against the stories of your coworkers? And to what extent is that a problem, and to what extent can you do something about that? Are there communication techniques? Are there, various strategies that we can use to kind of not necessarily align stories, but at least be clear with each other? If you are in management, how can you be clean about what the organization is asking you to do, what your personal values are, and where the line between those two and what you kind of expect from or impose upon the people who you're supervising? So in other words, where do our stories need to line up? Where is that absolutely essential? And where is it kind of optional? And say, well, we can get along. Even though we're not quite on the same page on this sort of a thing. I think advancing your career, in some ways, it's kind of similar to getting the job, in the sense of, asking yourself, what are the stories you tell yourself about your abilities, your capacity, the possibilities that are open to you for advancement, either in terms of your own skills or in terms of what the organization will support or allow, or whatever it is. What do you want, right? What is important to you? For some people, climbing the ladder is part of how they understand success, which is a story that they're telling themselves about what it means to, be successful, to do well. So I think again, a lot of the stuff around stories, it's not necessarily changing stories. Because as I think I said, stories are not necessarily bad, and stories don't necessarily need to be changed. Sometimes it's simply being aware of the fact that this is what we're doing, that we are putting a particular interpretation on something, which means that other people might put other interpretations on it, or we might choose in another situation, if we wanted to put another interpretation on it. Yeah, I think maybe I'm going around in circles a bit here now, but to say that I think at all levels of the workplace, being aware that one of the ways to think about what's going on for you and for you in your work is that there are a number of stories that are maybe competing, maybe coming into conflict, maybe contradicting, maybe working together, maybe collaborating, and to be sensitive to that.
Now, you recently did a webinar that was a teaching about stories and And do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, it's an introduction to this area. There's a couple of things I've said here are in that webinar, but there's lots of other stuff that isn't. And in it, I talk a bit about kind of this background of the nature of stories and how central stories are in the way we interpret our surroundings and our experience. And then I also, toward the end, I give a model, a tool, a way of giving ourselves a bit of distance. So, when we get to the point where we are equating the story we're telling about something with a hard and fast reality, there are things that we can do to begin to back off of that, to give us more space, to give us more flexibility. And so I've got a tool that I teach toward the end of that webinar about what you can do to begin to give yourself a bit more freedom around the stories you're telling.
And you're going to give that webinar to the listeners if they would like it, right? How do they get access to that?
Yeah, so you're going to put something in the show notes about this, and but you can go to my website, which is scottswanson.com, https:// blah, whatever, scottswanson.com. And the webinar is info.scottswanson.com/stories.
info.scottswanson.com/stories. Okay. And they can put in their info, and then they will get the link to the, how long is it?
I got it down to about 45 minutes. I think about 45 minutes.
Okay.
Yeah.
So a 45-minute class on this. And people can find you there. Where else can they find you?
I am in the interwebs all over the place. I have an Instagram channel that I don't look at very much, but one of our kids kind of manages that for me. Facebook. I'm more active on LinkedIn than some of those other places. But yeah, Twitter.
And you have a daily blog that you write every single day, because sometimes at 10 o'clock at night, it's like, oh no, I need to write a blog post.
Yeah. I started this back in September. I was inspired by, I would call him one of my mentors, but that sounds like I've met him and worked with him, which I never have.
Wish.
But only wish. Yeah. But inspired by Seth Godin, who's been writing a daily blog for like 27 years or something ridiculous like that. And so I've been doing that since September. And when you give me your email address in order to have a look at the webinar, you actually get a choice of either subscribing to that daily blog or to a shorter Friday-only version. And they're kind of all over the map. They're mostly around the theme of purpose, stories, one or two other kind of areas that I sort of tend to gravitate toward. And they vary in length from pretty short to not that short, but not super long. Yeah, and it's a little something that'll be there in your inbox every morning to either read and enjoy or delete.
All right. So do you have one last piece of advice for the Careers by Jenn listener?
I think, if you were to go to school on Brene Brown's technique of being able to just say, the story I'm telling myself right now that is a mindful, I want to say almost contemplative way to begin to anything that feels like it is undeniably true, hard and fast reality. If you can begin to say, to answer, to complete the sentence, the story I'm telling myself right now is, then you begin to see that what you are doing is actually interpreting something rather than describing it accurately. And once you've done that, once you've opened up the possibility that what you're doing is interpreting, you've now opened the possibility of other interpretations.
Thanks for being on the show today.
Hey, thanks for having me back on at the very end. And before we go, this is the second to last episode. You are moving on from podcasting. What's going on with you? What are your plans from here on?
Well, as some of the people who've been listening have heard and have come over to see, I've moved over to YouTube. This has been almost 10 years that this started in 2011. It was the very end of 2011, so it's not quite 10 years. But it's time to have a little bit of a change of scenery, I think. So I thought I would try something new and learn some new skills and shake it up a bit. Yeah, we're moving over to YouTube for something new.
You have been, this is kind of part of your approach to life. You're kind of a cutting edge sort of person. You got into podcasting when podcasting was still a pretty new thing. There weren't a lot of people in it, and there were very few women doing it. And now everybody and their dog has a podcast, it seems. And so it's time to move over to YouTube, which is not new, but it is, from what I'm reading and hearing, it's really kind of still in its early stages of growth. And I imagine a few years down the road, YouTube is going to be even more ubiquitous than it is now, and everybody and their dog will have a YouTube channel, but you will already have been there for a while and carving out your little space in the cyber world. So.
Let's hope, right? Yeah. And maybe we'll have a podcast and a YouTube channel, and who knows what else is coming next.
Well, and all the podcasts are available on your YouTube channel.
They are. They're all there, and they're still in the archives, and so you'll be able to go back and listen to all of those, and so they're not going anywhere. I'm just moving over for a little while.
And the creepy psycho guy is still at the beginning of all of them too. So,
are you coming back for next week?
No, I don't think so. I think I started in episode 2. And so I think it would be very fitting and very sort of symmetrical and poetic for you to finish the way you started, which was on your own, doing your own thing. So I think my intro today was my last one. And thanks for the opportunity. It's been fun. It's been an interesting creative endeavor. And like every creative endeavor, sometimes it's just hard, like, oh, I've got to come up with something for this week. But it's been fun to do. I've enjoyed it, and I'm glad that at least a few of your listeners have enjoyed it or not found it too off-putting.
Well, I've enjoyed having you collaborate in this way, and thank you, and thanks for being on today.
You're welcome. All the best.
You too. We'll see you at lunch.
Okay.
I hope you had fun with that. I know I did. And next week is our last time together for now. And at least on this platform. I do invite you to come over to YouTube, subscribe there so that you don't miss anything. I'm putting out at least 2 videos a week, sometimes 1, mostly 2. And on various topics, and all the backlog of podcasts are there as well. I will have the link to the webinar that we discussed that is free for you to access. I will have that down below in the show notes and also in the description box of the YouTube description. So check that out, take a listen to that, and if you want to sign up for Scott's daily blog, you can gain little nuggets of wisdom in your inbox every day. And other than that, thank you so much once again for listening. And until next time, take good care.